Hello, everyone, to today's Bite-Size Talk. And I'm very happy that today with us is Julia. And she's working at CRG in this part of the infrastructure team for NF Core. And today she is going to show us the template, the pipeline template, and explain to us what the different files mean. Is that correct?
Thank you, Fran.
So,
So
yep.
I prepared a pipeline created from the template from scratch with nothing modified and nothing special. And I plan to go through all the files that you can find and explain a little bit what they do. So first of all, I wanted to start with this file, the NF Core YAML, which in theory, you will never modify this manually, but this is important for us in NF Core because it's what we use to track how the pipeline was created. And I wanted to show you this just to explain a little bit that with NF Core tools, when you use this command NF Core pipelines create, it will ask you some things. And it will generate this pipeline and this file to track all what you introduce. So these are the main parts that you can customize in your pipeline when you first create it. And for example, we keep track, now I'm using the latest version of NF Core that we released last week. So it's 3.5.0. And in this file, you will see that in this case, it's a pipeline for NF Core. If you wanted to build a pipeline outside of NF Core, this would be different. This would be your organization. You have the name of the pipeline. Then you usually provide a short description of what this pipeline does, names of the authors, the version of your pipeline. And then we have some options to skip some parts of this pipeline template. In this case, we only have here GPU, which is always turned off by default. But when you run this command, NF Core pipelines create, you will have some boxes to tick if you want to skip, for example, if you don't want to add the default modules that we use in the template. And this will be tracked here. And then also we track some linting in case you need to skip some of the linting tests, but in general, this is never modified, it's created for you. And in general, you don't want to skip the linting tests. Okay, so once we have seen this, I will first show you the basics that we need in all Nextflow pipelines. You will always have a main.nf and a Nextflow config. So first we will see these two files, and then I will show you a little bit the important directories that we have with modules and workflows and so on. And then finally, I will go into a little bit more of the extra stuff that we have in the NF Core template. So first of all, you have your main NF file here, which is the one that will run the main workflow. In NF Core, we always have, so some of the things you don't have to modify in the template. Whenever there's an action that you need to do to start creating your pipeline, you will see these to-do comments, the NF Core to-dos, and they describe what you can, or what do you have to modify here. And here I wanted to show you very quickly, in case you are using VS Code, you have this little tree here with to-dos, and this will show you for every file all the to-do comments, and I think it's very convenient to go and see every one of them. So first of all, in this main NF, we have some igenoms. In case you are using igenoms in your pipeline, you will have defining the parameters FASTA. Then we have the first workflow that it's gonna run the test pipeline workflow, which is the one that is inside this folder workflows. And the main initial workflow. Here we always have some pipeline initialization that it's always up to some of the things that will run before running the main workflow. Then you run this NF core test pipeline, or the name of your pipeline. This pipeline is called test pipeline. And then finally, some pipeline completion, which are things that will run at the very end after running all the main workflow. And then in the Nextflow config file, which is also here in the base directory, we have several parameters. For example, we have our input. If you are using iGenomes, again, you have options, parameters for the references. In case you are using multi-QC, we have options for multi-QC, then some options for email and so on, and finally options for configuration. This you keep as is, but when you add new parameters to your pipeline, then you add them here. Then we always include these other config files from the conf directory, which I will explain more in detail later. And then we have some predefined profiles. These are some predefined sets of profiles that you can use. For example, these ones to run the pipeline with Conda, with Mamba, with Docker, and so on. This is already set for you, so you can directly run your pipeline with any of these. And at the very end of these profiles, you have the profile test, which we will see these config files later in the conf directory, and test full. These are the profiles that we use to run test data. In case you wanted to add some additional tests in your pipeline, for example, like the test profile that runs with parameter X, you can add a new profile here and a new config file, and then you can use this in your pipeline also. Then we have some, we are including some configs to use the defined config files that we have in the repository nfcore configs. And this is very quickly to explain what these are. You maybe already know them, but in nfcore we have this set of config files that you can add in our repository, and those are designed so that any center or for your institution, your HPC, for example, to define the set of configuration options that you need to run NF-core pipelines in this location. So this is what we use to be able to use all these configs in all our pipelines. And then you can also add one of these config files specific for your pipeline. If you do so, this line, you will have to uncomment it. And you, again, you have this to-do comment that tells you that you have to uncomment it. Then we have other defaults that we set. Some environment variables. In general, you don't have to modify anything here because these are things that we found that we have to set to make sure that the pipelines can run everywhere. And then we always generate these timelines, reports, and trace files and DAX for reproducibility. Then you will find the manifest. Here is where you have the name of the pipeline. You can add a list of contributors. So here you can add all the authors and maintainers and contributors of your pipeline with their affiliations and so on. And this is also generated for you with the short description of the pipeline. Then you have a minimum Nextflow version, the version of the pipeline, a DOI, and so on. Then we use the NF schema plugin. This is for validation of the input, sample sheet, and the parameters. And if, in case you want to use other Nextflow plugins, you can add them here. This is, again, for validation of parameters. And finally, we include this config for modules that we will see also later on. Okay, so now that we have seen the main NF and Nextflow config, you remember that in the main NF, we were running the main workflow of our pipeline. And this is inside workflows. And it's called testpipeline.nf. In some pipelines, you will see that you can have more than one workflow. But in general, you would have the main one here. And here is where you can use all the modules and sub workflows that you want to use in your pipeline. And here we have a minimal example to show you how we do it. For example, the input channel here is a sample sheet. Most of the NF Core pipelines use this kind of input as a sample sheet, which is usually a CSV or TSV file. And then, as an example, we are running first FastQC, then we collect the versions of the tools that we use. And finally, we run multi-QC, which will generate a report with all the parameters that were used in this run and also the versions of the tools and so on. And this, again, is standard. We have it in most of the pipelines. You can opt to not use multi-QC, or you can also modify it if you want to use it and add more things to your multi-QC report. And then finally, we emit the outputs. In this case, because it's very simple, we only emit the multi-QC report and the versions. And how to use the modules and sub workflows that we are using here at the top. We are including them, and these are stored in the modules and sub workflows directories. In general, you don't need to modify anything inside these directories, and this is because we can use the NF Core modules and sub workflows. So with this command NF Core modules install or NF Core sub workflows install, you will install the modules from the NF Core repository, and they will be installed here in this directory. If you see that there are all the files needed for the FastQC module, for example, and then you can directly include it and use it. So you don't have, this is very convenient because you can install the modules that you need if they are in NF Core, and you don't need to worry about them. You just have to use them. The only situation where you will want to go into these directories and modify the things is if your module or sub workflow cannot be added into the NF Core repository. And then you can, again, run the NF Core modules create or sub workflows create command, and they will create these files or a template of the module or the sub workflow here in the local directory. And then you will have to create your module. In the template, we have this util sub workflow, which I will not go into much detail here, but you have to know that we are working on creating an NF Core plugin so that we can reduce this code to the maximum, and then we won't need this local sub workflow. But basically here we have, if you remember, we were doing some initialization steps before the main workflow. This is basically to validate the input parameters. And then here is where we read the input channel using the NF schema plugin, which you can look for it, and it has a very nice written documentation. So you can check how to use this plugin. Basically, it reads the sample sheet. And then in this case, our sample sheet had like a meta map and FASTQ1, FASTQ2, and we are reading these channels and validating the input and preparing it for the main workflow. And then we have the completion sub workflow, which is the one that runs after the main sub workflow and does some steps, like, for example, this email or some steps for the multi-QC report. The only things that you may want to modify here, again, you will find the to-do comments, is these functions that we have here if you want to add citations or bibliography to your multi-QC report. Okay, so once we've covered already the workflow directory, the modules and the sub-workflows. So then we can go through the other directories that we have in the pipeline, which are some additional things that we have in NF Core. For example, very fast, the dev container is important. It's important if you want to use dev containers or the GitHub code spaces. And then we have the GitHub directory. Here, is where we have all the workflows for continuous integration testing in GitHub. So you usually don't have to modify anything here. Most importantly, we have some full tests that run on AWS with our sets of test data. Then we have some tests, for example, to make sure that the pipeline can be downloaded with the nfcore pipelines download command. We also have all our linting tests to make sure that it complies with the nfcore guidelines. And then we also have the nf tests that runs the test for the pipeline. So all of this is automated whenever you open a PR on GitHub or you make a release, all these actions are triggered and the pipeline is tested for you. Then we have some VS Code to make the files look nice if you are using VS Code. In this assets directory, we have, again, several files that you usually never have to modify yourself. For example, these adaptive cards of some things for the sending emails. If you are using MultiQC, you will have some MultiQC files here. The most important file that you may want to modify here is this schema input. This is used by the NF schema plugin. Again, I encourage you to go to the NF schema documentation and see how to use this to have like a more detailed explanation. So basically, this is the JSON schema that we use to read the sample sheet in this. For example, here you have an example sample sheet. This one I like to modify because it's nice to link to the documentation of how the sample sheet looks. In this very easy pipeline, for example, we have just a sample name, FASTQ1, FASTQ2. And then in the schema is what we use to validate these columns, like the sample, FASTQ1, and FASTQ2. So this you will probably have to modify to interpret your sample sheet and how it's done. So you can go to the NF schema documentation to see how to do it. Then we have this conf directory with all the Nextflow config files. Again, some of them, usually you don't have to modify them. For example, the base config has some definitions of labels that we use in NF-core modules, defining CPUs, memory, and time. And the only thing that you may want to have a look at, which is, again, marked here with comments, is the default CPUs, memories, and time for your pipeline. If you are using iGenomes, you also have some config files for iGenomes, which we include them by default. And again, you don't have to do anything to them. Then we have the test configs. This is basically you will define the input with your input sample sheet to run a test for your pipeline and all the parameters that you need for this test. And then we also have the test full, which is, again, running a test for your pipeline with a more realistic or real case scenario data set. And this is the one that we run in AWS. If you want to add more tests to your pipeline, then you would add another config file with the name of your test. And finally, we have this modules config file. Here is where we write the configuration for all the modules that the pipeline is using. In this pipeline, because we used FastQC and MultiQC, these are the two that we have. So first of all, we have a definition of this publish here, how to publish the output files of the pipeline. And then some arguments for FastQC, some arguments for MultiQC, and again, we modify a little bit the output directory of MultiQC. So here, if you need to specify arguments for your modules, you would add it here with the same structure. Okay, and then the documentation in the docs directory, you have some templates for documentation. So this is very important because if you, in the NF-core website, these are the files that are rendered there, the README, usage, and output. So if you make these files very pretty, then you have a very nice documentation in the NF Core website. So here we divide the things into the README, which links to the other two Markdown files. And we have the usage, which you will have to adapt. For example, we have here a little bit of structure of how you would do it. For example, you write an example of how your sample sheet looks like, a little bit of explanation of how to use your pipeline, how to run it, and so on. And then in the output Markdown, you have a definition of the outputs of your pipeline. In this case, for example, we have here FastQC, and it's explaining that in the output directory, there will be a FastQC directory with these files, and it describes the files. So this you would modify for your specific output of your pipeline. You would add all the files that you can find there and a description of this. Okay, and then finally, the last directory that we are missing is the tests, which includes all the testing of the pipeline, as the name says. And for this, we use nftest. So you will have this nft ignore file. This is to add some of the files that you want to ignore from the nftest snapshots. Same as nf schema. nftest, it lives apart from NF Core in its own repository, and it has its own documentation. So I encourage you to go there and check the documentation. In the NF Core website, we also have some guidelines of how to write these tests. And then we always have this default nftest file, which is defining like a basic test. You can always add more files with different names to add your specific test for your specific cases that you want. In this case, so for example, it's this is what we use to get the output files, and then we have these asserts to check that the workflow worked and it was successful, and some snapshots of the files. So this you can see in the NF Core documentation, all the different kinds of testing that you can do. Okay, and then finally, we're missing all these small files that we have here in the base directory. Some of them, again, you will never modify them manually. So for example, these git ignore, git attributes, you never have to modify. Then we have some pre-commit and pre-tier files that also you never modify. This is just to make sure that the code looks nice and it's consistently formatted through all NF Core pipelines. Then we have the changelog, which is very useful to keep track of the development of the pipeline. So I really encourage everyone to use this. We have a file for citations where we have the citations of NF Core and Nextflow. And here you can also add the citations of the different tools that you are going to use in your pipeline. We have the NF Core code of conduct and the license. Then we have a modules.json file that you will never modify manually. This is just used for our tooling. Whenever you install a module or a sub workflow, this file is updated, and it helps us to keep track of everything that's going on in the pipeline. Then we have the Nextflow schema.json. This file is important, but again, don't be scared if it looks a little bit ugly and it's very long, because this one you also don't have to modify manually. We have this command NF Core schema build that will show you like a nice interactive web where you can drag and drop, and you can define. So this file is the one used by NF schema to validate all the input parameters. So you will have to write all the parameters of your pipeline, and then you can put a description, the type, for example, if it's a string, and many different options. But this, as I said, you use this nfcore schema build command, and you will have a nice interactive way to do it, so you don't have to modify this manually. Then we have the nftest config file. This is the config for the tests that we run. In general, you also don't need to modify anything here. We have a README file where you will write like a short description of your pipeline and a little bit of basic documentation of the pipeline, which you can modify here. And also maybe worth mentioning, whenever the pipeline is first released, you will generate like a Zenodo link for the pipeline, so it can be cited and referenced. And then the last two files, you also don't have to modify. We have this Procreate file, which is it's generated automatically by nfcore, and this helps us to upload all our pipelines to Workflow Hub. But it will be generated for you, so you really don't have to worry about this file. And finally, we have this Tower YAML, which is for the Sequera platform outputs. Yeah, so I think that's all. This walkthrough through the pipeline template, and if someone has any question and needs an additional explanation, happy to answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. So do we have any questions from the audience? Because otherwise I might just start. I always wondered, why do we have a main and a workflow.nf? Why not just use one?
Yeah, so in general, if you want to write a very basic Nextflow pipeline, you just need a main.nf. But this is very useful for us so if you follow the discussions that we're having in Nextflow and nfcore, we are working on the on pipeline chaining, which means that basically you will be able to install a pipeline into another pipeline. And then it's nice because maybe you have for example, a very typical example is RNA-seq, and then you want to run differential abundance for differential expression of genes. So now you have to first run RNA-seq and then prepare your output and then run differential abundance. But if we are able to chain pipelines, we will be able to do this all at once. So this is very useful because we have this emit of the outputs, and this kind of structure will be useful whenever this is possible. And then the other reason is because in the workflows, usually we have only one main workflow, but some pipelines have more than one. Depending on the case, you can have let's call it 2 branches of the pipeline, and then you can divide them into different workflows.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions? No, then everything is crystal clear. So thank you so much, Julia, for taking the time, and thank you for everyone in the audience. And I hope to see you again for the next Bite Size Talk. Thank you.
Thanks.